Hi Year 13, welcome to this lecture looking at how best to plan and answer a Unit 4 Crime and Deviance exam paper, making sure that you make best use of your time, the use of the items, and also really thinking about the exam skills that the AQA examiners are really looking for. So I've done this lecture looking at the January 2012 paper, which I don't think you guys can get anymore on the AQA website. And this is what your exam will look like when you go into your exam this summer. Obviously, it won't be January 2012, though. It's a 2-hour paper, and I would encourage you, after listening to this lecture and making notes about this paper, to actually spend 2 hours answering the questions. The key thing is to make sure you always have a black pen for the exam. And the paper is divided into 2 different sections. However, be really, really careful and make sure that you only do the first section because you guys have had all your lessons on crime and deviance. Do not look at stratification and differentiation. That's not your subject. When it comes to planning and rough work, I would always suggest you do your plan on the actual question paper itself, because that means you can have the plan in front of you and you don't have to keep on flicking back and forth throughout your answer booklet, so to speak. So I would always suggest to do your plans, ideally, on the actual question paper. If you do any rough work in your answer booklet, cross it out. However, one thing I would say is when you, and you should obviously reread your essays if you've got time, and you decide that you want to add in an additional point or you want to change something, it's really important that you do not squeeze your handwriting in, okay? Don't write around the edges of your examination booklet, and don't try and write, 2 sentences on one line if you like. It's much more important for you to use things like symbols or numbers and then write the full sentences later on in the examination booklet. The reason being that your exam answers are now generally uploaded onto an online marking service, and the examiners who look at the online version, quite often you can't see everything that's actually in the margin. So if you've written something in the margin and the examiner can't read it, then they won't give you any credit for it. So make sure that any additions or any edits that you add in later are very clear and within, if you like, the correct part of the exam paper, not in the margins. Yep, so this exam paper is out of 90 marks, and it's 2 hours. So this paper and all crime and deviance papers are really, really useful because they tell you quite explicitly how long you should be spending on each question. So do pay attention to your timings. Don't do what many people do and write far too much for the first and second question and completely run out of time, particularly for that last 33-mark question where loads of people drop marks. So yes, 30 minutes on question 1 and 2 each, and then 20 minutes on question 3, which is your methods and context question, and 40 minutes on your 33-mark question at the very end. I always find it useful to have a read through the whole entire exam paper, reading the items and reading the questions, because I find that, if I've got the time, it helps me remember some key points I might be able to use in different essays. So I would suggest having a quick read through all of the items and all of the questions. Okay, so there's item A, about labelling theory. The question's going to be about labelling theory. Item B is about globalisation. Question, obviously, on globalisation and the different types of crime that have been committed. Have a quick look at, the methods and context question. It's on investigating court proceedings. And the method here is covert observation. Any ideas that I might be having just by quickly scanning, I might write them down around the edge. And the theory and methods, the 33-mark question, is looking at the contribution of functionalism and new right research. It's up to you. If you feel that you are confident in that 33-mark question, have a go at doing it first, possibly. Some people do that. I don't do that generally, but some people do that. And because it's such a high-value question, I can highly recommend doing that if that's something that you prefer to do. Anyway. So here we are back at question 1. Now, this question asks you to use material from item A and elsewhere to assess the usefulness of labelling theory in explaining crime and deviance. The key thing here really is to try and get as much information from the item as possible and try and use that to help you maybe structure 1 or 2 points. So the first point, labelling theory explains how actions become labelled as criminal or deviant in society. This is a micro approach that looks at how individuals construct society based on their interactions with each other. So there you might want to think about how can you use that point to help you answer the question. Okay, the fact that it's a micro approach, are you going to make an argument saying actually the fact that it's a micro approach makes it useful or possibly doesn't make it useful? That's one way of using the item. The second paragraph is really interesting. Labelling theorists argue that an action is criminal only when society views it as criminal, and that crime, therefore, is a social construction. I would be highlighting words like social construction. Criminality exists only because of the laws constructed by society. I might highlight that bit about laws constructed by society. And deviance exists only because of the norms constructed by society. You might highlight norms there as well. So that's a really interesting paragraph, and I think you can link in a few ideas there, and I would suggest you annotate around that, whose ideas does that sound like? Where have we heard the idea that, it's all about, it only becomes criminal when somebody decides that it's a criminal activity? Who said that? And obviously, hopefully be thinking, that's Becker. Secondly, criminality exists only because the law is constructed by society. Who have we looked at, or what theory have we looked at that would agree with that idea? So, if you want to develop your analysis, who said about unfair law creation or unequal law creation? So again, you might want to link in maybe a bit of Marxism and say, actually, Marxists can support labelling theorist point of view. This is interesting, this last one. Deviant or criminal individuals are labelled when their actions are discovered and provoke a reaction from society. However, this reaction will take differing forms depending on how the nature of the action is perceived. Lots of things to think about there. Deviants are labelled when their actions are discovered. So remember, we've been looking at in class, well, hang on, what about the person who's walking next to the person who doesn't get stopped and searched? They might have drugs or a knife on them, but they don't get stopped and they're never seen as deviant. Whose ideas can you talk about there, and what impact does being labelled deviant have on people? You might want to think about ex-offenders and things like that. Definitely thinking about things like moral panics, possibly here as well. So the key thing for this question, generally, this question was well answered in the summer. However, the examiners did comment that there wasn't much in-depth analysis about the labelling theory itself, and there's also a lack of evaluation. So I would suggest for a 21-mark question, you do a very brief introduction, possibly use a quote from the item to make sure you've used the item, because that's important. Or maybe just be really clear about your understanding of what the labelling theory is. And then I would suggest trying to come up with a debate where you have an argument that agrees the labelling theory is useful, then an argument that says, no, actually it's not useful and this is why, and another argument saying, however, the labelling theory is still useful because of this, and come up with your evidence, obviously, and try and go into that detailed analysis. And then again, try and find a final point that challenges the usefulness of labelling theory. And then you'll have a conclusion. When it comes to this sort of question, key things like, concepts, you want to talk about self-fulfilling prophecy, master status, but you do want to talk about some of the studies. And I think labelling theory is a really easy one to develop analysis, because we've looked at so many studies that have used labelling or the idea of people being labelled as deviant, things like deviancy amplification. We've looked at moral panics. So you should be able to link the ideas of, say, Becker with Stan Cohen or Jock Young, and that will show your ability to analyse. I suppose the more challenging element here was how to evaluate labelling theory using other perspectives. So that's what you've got to really think about. Where's your criticism going to come from? Who would disagree with the labelling theory being useful? Who would say it's a bit useless because of A, B, and C, for example? So try and think which perspectives would argue that labelling theory is not a very useful perspective. Or is there anything wrong with some of the labelling theories themselves? Can you think of any criticisms in that sense? You must be able to develop your analysis and your evaluation. And I guess your evaluation should not be, however, Marxists would disagree with the labelling theorists because Marxists believe that crime is caused by relative deprivation, and then go into a discussion about Marxist view on crime and deviance. That's not evaluation. That's you talking about another perspective. That's not you evaluating labelling theory. That's just saying that Marxists have a completely different idea. So that's not how you evaluate. So, after you've done your conclusion, reached a judgment, do you think it's useful? Why do you think it's useful? Trying hard to sort of summarise the arguments above and come to your own judgment with supported evidence. You need to move on, because within the half an hour, on to the next question. Now, I've talked to you about this question in class, and this question's on globalisation, number 2, and you won't be able to answer this question, I don't think, unless you've looked at the lecture on globalisation and green crime. Thinking about the first question, sorry, I don't have a lecture for the labelling theory just yet. You'll have to look at your class notes. So the second question, sorry, on globalisation and crime, you need to make sure you've watched that lecture and done some of the reading from the textbook, and don't forget that blue handout I gave you in class as well. So here we are. This one item looks at the idea that, the question first, using material from item B and elsewhere, assess the view that the process of globalisation has led to changes in both the amount of crime and types of crime committed. So the first thing I would do is circle amount of crime and circle types of crime, because you're going to have to make sure you address both those aspects of the question. Okay, and the key process here is globalisation, which we've talked about loads across lots of topics. So here we are. Some sociologists would define globalisation as increasing interconnectedness in the world. So there we go, that's nice, and they're giving you a definition. Globalisation is multi-causal, and there are a number of key processes and events that have aided its development, including technological innovation. So straight away I'd be writing, e.g. internet, planes, whatever you need to write. Global crises, you've got the war and terror. The end of the Cold War, so again, that's like the end of the Cold War between, if you like, the United States and Russia, and the collapse of the communist Russia, if you like. The growth of transnational organisations, so these are organisations that kind of go over the borders of countries. So Google's a transnational organisation, Apple's a transnational organisation. If you like, the Bhopal disaster, that company was a transnational organisation because it was like an American company, Union Carbide, I think it was, based in India, transnational, going across borders. And finally, the expansion of free trade, which is the free trade between countries, if you like, not being taxed. Views on the impact of globalisation on crime vary. Globalisation has led to changes in the opportunities to commit crime. Okay, so yeah, straight away I'll be thinking, oh, hang on, what opportunities to commit crime are being developed because of globalisation? Things like, the technology, the international war and terror, those sorts of things. And this has actually meant increases in some types of crime, such as fraud, and brand new crimes, such as cybercrime. So this ICE has given you loads of information, lots of ideas to get started. So same sort of structure as the first 21 mark question. You need to start off with a very brief introduction, okay? I would show that you clearly understand what globalisation is. I probably would even use that quote directly from the item and maybe explain what that means. Increased interconnectedness, what does that actually mean? I would then make sure that my question addressed the amount of crime being committed and the types of crime being committed. So you might want to do an argument saying, because it's asking you to assess the view that globalisation has effectively made crime worse, or hasn't it made crime worse? So you need to think about how we're going to evaluate this. So yes, you do need to talk about how globalisation maybe has contributed to an increase in the amount of crime being committed. You then might need to do a point, and yes, globalisation has led to brand new types of crimes being committed. We might see less, for example, bank robbery with guns, and maybe more bank robbery using hacking, for example. That might be something you want to talk about because of technological innovation. But you also need to think, hang on, how am I going to sort of put this question in some sort of theoretical context? So when you talk about globalisation, what theory do you think you need to talk about if you're talking about the role of globalisation? So hopefully you've all thought of postmodernism, because these are all ideas that postmodernism would be very, very interested in. It's also worth thinking, I know it's not on the item, but arguably globalisation, if you think about it, we were talking about it in class, in beliefs, globalisation has led to the increase of religious fundamentalism, that reaction against, Western cultural change. And you might want to do a point on that, but be really clear when you talk about fundamentalism, you talk about the sort of terrorist fundamentalism, because that's the crime. Fundamentalism is just a belief system by itself, so you need to make sure you're linking back to the question on crime. So once you've made sure you've clearly identified yes or no, it's created more crime, and yes, it's created lots of different types of crime, you do need to sort of evaluate and say, well, actually, hang on, has it all been bad for crime? Is there any argument to say, actually, globalisation has been good for crime prevention? So that's something you might need to think about. Like, how has globalisation helped to prevent particular types of crime? Like, because of globalisation, are we more aware of particular issues, maybe around about the environment possibly? Are we more likely to kind of prevent them on a global action? That's something you might want to think about. Like I said, you do need to try and think about some of the studies you might want to talk about. So you might want to talk about Ian Walton, and you might want to talk about Beck and the risk-conscious society. You might even want to talk about Leotard and scientific developments and how science has created more risk in a globalised world. But you do have to link in some theory here. And then obviously come to a conclusion on your view of whether globalisation has actually changed crime and the amount of crime and the type of crime committed. So moving on to your methods in context question. Now, just to remind you about methods and context, and there is a whole other lecture on here about how to answer an A2 MIC question, so do have a look at that. But the key element here is to make sure, firstly, every point that you write about is linking it back to the context. So let's have a read of the question. Using material from item C and elsewhere, assess the strengths and limitations of using covert observation as a means of investigating court proceedings. Very similar structure for all types of research methods question. You need to circle the method, covert observation, and the context, investigating court proceedings. So that's what you need to make sure all your points link back to investigating court proceedings. Okay, the item's brilliant. Lots of stuff to link into the question. You've got 20 minutes of this one, so again, you're aiming for, I'd say, 4 good points. Wouldn't even bother with an introduction because you've only got very limited time. But if you need to do an introduction, maybe quickly do a definition of what covert observation is, something along those lines. So, remember, research methods questions, methods and context, you need to make sure you talk about practical, ethical, and theoretical issues. P-E-T. I would always suggest starting off with the theoretical, the T, because I always think that's the more challenging one. Talk about the positivism versus interpretivism debate over this particular method. In this case, it's covert observation. But make sure you link your points about whether, because interpreters would like, let's face it, covert observation. Why would they like it to investigate court proceedings? They would say things about validity, okay? They might even talk about, well, are you more likely to get natural behaviour? But then you might want to think about things like Verstehen, like would interpreters say, actually, by observing court proceedings from the public gallery, can you get a Verstehen? And then you might want to discuss another point, saying, however, positivists would not think this method was weak because it's not objective. And, you need to go into that kind of debate. But again, you need to link it back into investigating courtroom proceedings. That's what's really, really important. So do have a read through the item and see if there's any ideas there for theoretical issues. Just at the very bottom there, line 10, it says cases usually involve the use of formal language and technical concepts. So if you are a researcher sitting in the public gallery and you're not able to kind of go down and be like, oh, can you explain that word? How might that affect the validity of your research? That's kind of like a theoretical issue. The other 2 issues you must talk about are practical issues, obviously, and ethical issues in any order. But don't forget, the key thing is recognising the tension between maybe a method being really, really valid might not be such a practical method, and being able to make that kind of link in the first line of your next point. So you will probably have argued that covert observation is a very valid way of conducting research of court proceedings for this, that, and the other, and linked it back to courts. Your next point might be like, however, it's not a very practical method because of things like, time, okay? And that recognises that, yes, you can have a valid method, but it might not be a practical method. Now, read the item. First line, it says, one location in which crime can be investigated is a courtroom. Most criminal courts are open for the public to view proceedings. There you go. That is a practical issue. That's telling you, practically, it's easy to get access to courtrooms, all right? So that's something you should make a note of. You might also want to think of, can you get access to all criminal trials? Like, what if they involve children? So that's something you might want to say. However, not all, you might not get access to all of them. And the final thing you must talk about is ethical issues. And covert observation, the minute you see the word covert, the phrase informed consent should sort of flash up in your head in like neon lights, because covert observation will not get informed consent. But, again, if you're researching from the public gallery, do you need informed consent from the judges and the juries and, the lawyers and the defendants? Well, no, because anyone from the public gallery has a right to be there. Okay, but you are conducting sociological research, you might be profiting from that research. These are all things you need to think about from an ethical point of view. And then, quick conclusion, saying, assessing, bringing it all together, is it an appropriate method for this kind of particular bit of research? It is worth maybe trying to think about what study on suicide, if you remember, said that we should be going, in fact, actually, he did go into courtrooms and observe the coroners and try and work out how they reach their decisions. So that might be something you might want to talk about. So have a look at your suicide notes. Which bit of research actually went into courtrooms? Because you might be able to use that as an example of covert observation. Finally, you've got 40 minutes on your theory and methods questions. You need to read the question, assess the contribution of functionalist and new right theories and research to our understanding of society today. This is clearly a theory question. So you need to use the MOT, the method, other synoptic links, and theoretical history structure. One of the things I'd just highlight here is it has to be about society today. So you need to link back all your points as to whether these are relevant theories for society today. And you might quickly think, oh, hang on, are there any reasons? Try and think, are there any reasons why functionalism is an outdated theory? Is the new right approach completely outdated? Can you think of any evidence to say, oh, they're out of date? Because that would help you with your other side of the argument. With this question, it's really, really important to make sure that you do address both functionalism and the new right. However, it does say that it's not necessary to cover both theories equally, even for full marks, okay? So if you can discuss the relevance of functionalism to today's society and then assess the new right in at least maybe 1, maybe 2 points, actually 2 points I'd say, and say that whether they are relevant to society today, that's what they're really looking for, okay? Focusing on that society today, okay? You should be aware of, in terms of their methodology, the sorts of methods that functionalists like to use. You can use Durkheim's study of suicide, but be careful you don't end up just describing his study and his findings. That's not what this is about. You need to say, why did Durkheim choose statistics? Okay, why do functionalists prefer quantitative statistical data? And it links to the idea that they're looking for social facts, so they're looking for patterns. Particularly Durkheim, who believed that the role of sociology was to discover facts and then use them to try and improve society. So that's quite important from the methodological point of view. If you like, other synoptic areas is probably where you're going to be able to talk about the most about the new right. Like, what new right contributions can you think of to the understanding of the family, for example? Now, I know we haven't studied it, but you guys should know about the new right's view on families and family types. And you might want to think, well, have they influenced things like, policy today? Has the new right view of what a family should be like influenced policy? Things like, the fact that married couples get tax breaks, that's sort of a bit of a new right idea, which suggests they are still relevant. However, you might want to argue from a postmodern point of view that, their views on family types, nuclear family being the only type of family, is now outdated. That's kind of what you need to do for functionalism and new right. I'm not going to give you any more hints, otherwise I'll end up answering the question for you. But yes, make sure you cover new right and functionalism. Oh, one thing I would say is don't forget to link new right to right realism, okay? And explain that right realism, if you like, is the criminology branch of new rightism. And I know that you know about the ideas of Charles Murray, for example. But don't neglect functionalism, okay? And you can use your textbook as well, of course, to help you answer this, okay? Thinking about how do functionalists themselves disagree with each other, because the T of the MOT looks for the history of the theory, but also variation within the theory. And you've got Durkheim, you've then got Parsons, but you've got the neo-functionalists as well, don't forget, like Bella and Merton as well. How do they kind of disagree with each other? Recognise that, functionalism is not a unified theory necessarily. So be very careful when you get to your theory and methods question that it's not actually a methods question. So any questions that are on value freedom, assess the view that sociology can and should be value free, assess the view that sociology can and should be a science, assess the usefulness of interpretivist methods for researching society today, assess the view that positivist methods are the best methods for research in society today. They are all research methods questions, and you need to make sure that you use a slightly different framework, which is basically the old PET, the practical, ethical, theoretical issues. Okay, you need to make sure you talk about those and about whether those sorts of approaches are useful. And like I said, there are also lectures on my YouTube channel about value freedom. We haven't done it as a topic in class yet, but feel free to have a look at them in advance if you do want help with that particular type of question over the break when you're revising. Thank you very much for listening.